The most stereotypical muscle that pretty much rounds out a perfect looking arm is, you bet, it's the biceps. Now, I have particularly decent biceps relative to the rest of my physique, and partially it came down to knowing what exercises to avoid wasting my time on. So here are the 3 worst bicep exercises you should avoid if you're trying to maximize biceps growth. Let's get into it. So technically there are 2 heads of the biceps, the long head as well as the short head. And in fact, if you flex your bicep and then let's see if I can find the hole, you're gonna see that right here is gonna be the long head on the outside of my arm. The inner side, this is gonna be more of the short head. Kind of interesting party trick you can do if you're at a low enough body fat percentage. Literally poke your hole through the bicep. And to be honest, I don't think it's worth trying to bias one head over the other like a lot of people will tell you to do. In reality, both heads of the biceps are going to be involved in pretty much any bicep exercise you do. And with that said, if you're still curious on how potentially you can do so, well, the biggest thing you can do is change the rotation of your shoulders. So if you're externally rotating like here, this is going to be a more long head focus bicep exercise. On the contrary, if you internally rotate your shoulders, this is going to be more of a short head focus bicep curl. Now, when I'm choosing a bicep exercise, do I really consider the rotation of my shoulder? Not really. It might be like a tertiary factor I actually consider. But for the most part, I'd much rather focus on an exercise that feels good for me and it has a somewhat advantageous resistance profile for training the biceps. I think these are more important factors in general. So with that said, let's get to the first worst exercise to avoid. All right, guys, so exercise number 1 that you should avoid is definitely the underhand grip bent over row. Now, a lot of people think, all right, so I'm gonna get the most bang for my buck if I do a compound movement. And okay, when it comes to the row, if I take an overhand grip, that's gonna be more back focused, but if I take an underhand grip, that's gonna be more biceps, right? Well, relatively speaking, yes, that is true. If you're trying to maximize biceps growth, you're probably gonna wanna do an isolation exercise for your biceps where there's no other muscles involved. Because you see, if we take the definition of a compound movement, it is a multi-joint movement. Usually if there's 2 joints involved, that usually means there's gonna be multiple muscles involved. In this case, it's gonna be not only the biceps, but also the back. And like I mentioned in the top 3 worst triceps video, relying on a compound movement for your biceps volume is probably not the best idea. And it doesn't end there because you have to keep in mind that the biceps are also biarticular, meaning they cross both the elbow joint as well as the shoulder joint. As a result, when we're doing a row motion, which is pretty much something like this, right? You're getting elbow flexion as well as shoulder extension. We're gonna be contracting the biceps at the elbow joint, but we're gonna be stretching the biceps at the shoulder joint. Now, I made a whole video about biarticular muscles. If you wanna check out that video, definitely you can watch that. But TLDR with that is, if a muscle is shortening at one joint and then lengthening at the other, that means it can't really meaningfully stretch and contract, which is gonna be how you actually train muscles to begin with. As a result, the biceps are gonna be disadvantaged on a row because of this biarticular nature. Now, let's forget all of that. Who cares about that biarticular stuff? If we even look at the range of motion for an underhand row, we're essentially doing a lengthened partial for the biceps. If we look at our elbow angle, we're only contracting this much, right? So this is why I say you're probably better off doing an isolation exercise like a bicep curl where you're actually able to get a full range of motion rather than just something like this. Now, if you guys are clever and have been watching a lot of my videos, you might be thinking, well, the biceps are gonna have the best leverage to do elbow flexion in this bottom part of the range of motion, so does it really matter all that much if we're getting a full range of motion? That is admittedly a fair point. However, considering the resistance profile of the movement, no tension in the beginning, you're only gonna get the most resistance with your arm back here. Compared to a bicep curl, which should have a more even resistance profile in that more lengthened position. Now, that was a lot to take in, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you're thinking, Tyler, honestly, I just want to take the guesswork out of getting to my fitness goals, then I highly recommend you apply to my exclusive one-on-one fitness coaching program where I do pretty much just that. There's custom workout programs, there's gonna be meal recommendations, the ability to message and ask any questions you have, as well as weekly check-ins. So if that sounds interesting to you, find the link in the description, check out these transformations. This can potentially be you too. Let's get back to the video. And as you may have guessed, the alternative I recommend instead of the underhand grip row is some sort of bicep curl. You can choose whichever one you like the most. I personally prefer the preacher curl because it has a more lengthened resistance profile. But with that said, if you're only limited to body weight stuff, and if you had to choose a compound movement, I'd actually opt to do a chin up, so essentially a pull up with an underhand grip, over something like an underhand grip row, because at least this way, you're getting at least a better range of motion where you're able to pretty much fully contract the biceps, as you see here, compared to the lengthened partial we were getting earlier with the underhand grip row. So with that said, let's get on to the second exercise. And real quick, if you're in need of some nice gym clothes, I highly recommend you at least check out Able. Now, Able released their men's line roughly less than a year ago, so their men's line is relatively new. Not a lot of people are wearing it, so if you want to be unique and stuff, definitely a good option. Now, I really like these Ascend shorts where they have a zipper on them. Let's see, look at that. As well as this running slit, so they're super ergonomic. Again, I like to think of this brand as like the quality of Alphalete, but at the price point of something more closer to like Gymshark, right? So it's a good deal, definitely check it out. And if you're interested in copying something, definitely use code PATH for 10% off at checkout. Let's get back to it. So let me tell you a story about the second exercise. A couple years ago, a very famous individual decided that instead of performing a dumbbell bicep curl normally like this, he opted to turn the dumbbell on his head and perform the curl like this, resembling a server serving you some delicious pasta. Hence the name of this exercise, which is the Weiter Curl. Now, to the credit of this exercise and its creator, this exercise actually solves a big problem that some people struggle with on the bicep curl, and that is excessively flexing their wrist forward like this. Now, the issue with curling your wrist like this when you're doing a bicep curl is the wrist flexors are involved in the act of taking your wrist from here to here. Thus, you're technically taking away tension from the biceps and moving it a little bit onto these wrist flexors. So instead, ideally when you do a bicep curl, you want to focus on keeping your wrist neutral. However, with the Weiter curl, because of this weird grip, you start in a wrist flex position and then you gradually let your hand go into extension as you curl, which is obviously a good thing and pretty much the only thing I can think of that's good about this exercise. But when it comes to disadvantages, it's really weird to grip the dumbbell this way. So your grip becomes more of a limiting factor, especially if you want to be able to fully extend your elbow here, where you're gonna have to like change your grip and slide it in as you curl. Most people actually avoid that and they just kind of keep a static grip like this. And now the range of motion is gonna be limited in the bottom over here as I'm not really fully extending my elbow. As I mentioned before, the biceps have the best leverage to do the act of elbow flexion, which is the act of bending your elbow like this, from around 0, which is a straight elbow, all the way to up to around 80 degrees. Thus, if we're missing the range of motion in the bottom, that's kind of an ideal scenario to be in, especially when it comes to wanting to maximize biceps. So ultimately, I would just avoid doing the Weiter curl and opt for either a regular bicep curl or even better, some sort of lengthened focused bicep curl, like I mentioned earlier, the preacher curl. In fact, the dumbbell preacher curl is probably my favorite way to actually do a preacher curl in the first place. And going back to that problem about wrist flexion, for most people, that issue goes away if you're just mindful to not curl your wrists when you're doing a bicep curl. It's especially easy to do if you're doing some sort of unilateral curl. But let's challenge ourselves. Let's say we only have one dumbbell to work with, exactly like on a Weiter curl, no other pieces of equipment we can use. Well, in my opinion, you're better off doing a unilateral dumbbell curl where you're self-bracing with the other hand. Call it a self-bracing unilateral dumbbell curl. Now, with your offhand, you're essentially using this as almost an arm blaster to help stabilize the shoulder joint and avoid you using momentum when you do a bicep curl. I think this is gonna be a much better option than the Weiter curl because, for one thing, you're able to get a full range of motion, your grip's not gonna be a limiting factor, and you have the added stability of using your little arm over here in order to, like I mentioned before, brace yourself and avoid using momentum on the movement. Now, the third exercise you want to avoid if you're trying to train your biceps is going to be a hammer curl, with the caveat if you're doing the hammer curl alone, meaning you're not doing any other biceps movements, you're just relying on a hammer curl. You see, the hammer curl is not a bad exercise, but it is not a biceps exercise. What you're really doing here is training the brachialis as well as the brachioradialis. So to explain this, there's three main muscles that contribute in the act of bending your elbow, okay? And based off your wrist position, you're able to control what muscle you're biasing. If you're taking a supinated grip, as you already know, you're gonna be biasing the biceps. However, once you start getting away from that supinated grip and you move more into neutral grip or even a reverse grip territory, Then you're gonna be shifting focus away from the biceps and more onto the brachialis, which sits underneath the biceps, as well as the brachioradialis, which is a part of your forearm. And this isn't just a matter of semantics. The brachialis is not the biceps muscle. While yes, it does sit underneath the biceps, and an overall bigger brachialis probably means an overall bigger upper arm. If you're only relying on doing the hammer curl and not anything else to train your biceps, you're actually not really gonna be developing the biceps brachii itself. Instead, you're just gonna be growing the muscle underneath it. So instead, I recommend doing hammer curls as a supplement movement to supinated bicep curls, okay? Meaning, if your goal is to maximize biceps growth, you probably wanna be doing more supinated type curls, not only with a dumbbell like this, but on a cable. It could be a machine, it could be a rope. You wanna be supinating more often than you do a neutral grip hammer curl. Thus, the alternative if you're trying to maximize biceps growth is, instead of doing whatever hammer curl you're doing, turn your wrists and do a supinated version of that. It pretty much goes across any exercise you do. And if you're wondering how the hammer curl would fit in an overall workout program, it really depends on your goals, but I would ideally try to do hammer curls once to twice per week. You really don't need any more than that. Those were the 3 worst bicep exercises that you should avoid if you're trying to maximize biceps growth. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please leave a like, support my page. Easiest way to do so is completely free. Hit subscribe if you want to level up your physique. And don't forget to hit the bell notification and get these videos right to you so you're not caught in the gym doing Weiter curls because you didn't see this video on time. Damn, man. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Peace.